ready to go. I'm getting a little fired up. Today's episode comes from a live stream we did a few weeks ago with a good friend of Pascal. I believe they're fraternity brothers, Professor Jeff Canady, who does a lot of extensive work in eugenics. And Pascal and I weren't prepared for Jeff to have, his seminar speech ready for us. Jeff actually does a lot of speaking engagements. And look, I'll be honest. If I get a person on the show that I know, and if you've listened to this show before, if I get a person on the show that I know that does a lot of speak professors and like that, they usually have, it feels like they have something pretty ready to go. They're used to speaking for long periods of time. So I can ask a question and kind of get out of their way. Not that Mr. Canady is not like this. We just didn't know he was going to be so ready. So in a lot of this show, you're going to hear Pascal and myself just kind of moving out of the way for a lot of this discussion, because I'm not really up on eugenics. I'm not going to lie. I feel like a lot of people, usually when I hear the term eugenics, I think of crazy Nazi science experiments, and I think of all the G.I. Joe episodes I saw, or watching the same G.I. Joe episode over and over again when they create Serpentor. So, but it's a real thing, and Professor Canady really puts it into perspective of where we are today, especially with the education system, with the public education system. And I found this essay about Mr. Canady from about 3 years ago, from the guy, if you remember, Dave Chappelle had a skit. It was a fake game show called Do You Know Black People? And the first contestant on there was a professor of black history at Fordham, Mark Naison. He's a real professor of history. And he wrote this in 2018 about Jeff Canady. And he titled it The Whistleblower as Prophet, How Jeff Kennedy's Warnings About Corruption in D.C. Public Schools All Proved to Be Accurate. Ever since I began going to demonstrations in Washington to protest federally coordinated attacks on public schools and public school teachers, a Washington teacher named Jeff Canady has been buttholing me. Buttonholing. Not buttholing. Buttonholing. I'll repeat that line again. Oops on my part. A Washington teacher named Jeff Canady has been buttonholing. This is really hard to say. We'll just skip past that. And other protesters say that to understand the attacks on public education nationally, you have to focus attention on what was happening in the Washington, D.C. public schools. Jeff insisted all the most damaging features of federal education policy, test-based school and teacher evaluation, school closings and teacher firings, promotion of charter schools and alternative teacher certification programs were being implemented in the D.C. public schools with devastating consequences, no oversight, and no critical press coverage. While the leaders of the D.C. public schools were being hailed by everyone from Oprah Winfrey to Arne Duncan as leaders of an education revolution destined to sweep the nation, they were crushing the D.C. black community by firing hundreds of black teachers, closing neighborhood schools that had served black communities for generations, and bringing in young teachers from programs like Teach for America, who had no understanding of the history and culture of D.C. black communities and little ability to mentor or guide black students. What was taking place in D.C., Jeff insisted, was a new form of the eugenic policies that had always been key elements in the nation's approach to black communities, as well as the logic underpinning the development of intelligence testing and college entrance exams. Like many others exposed to Jeff arguments, I was rendered speechless by what he said. Even if he was right, how could we get the evidence to back up his claims when no one in the D.C. press or D.C. teacher union leadership was doing the research to prove how corrupt the D.C. school system was, or how CD school policies were promoting gentrification and ethnic cleansing of the D.C. professional class? I told Jeff many times that I don't have the time or energy to do research on the D.C. school system or lobby Congress to expose the corruption. I had had enough to do fighting off destructive policies in New York City and New York State. However, in the last 3 or 4 years, information has finally come out that has proven that everything Jeff Canady was telling us in 2011 and 2012 was right. Recently exposed graduation scandals in D.C. high schools where principals and DCPS officials were, quote-unquote, cooking the books to make troubled schools seem successful, were forcing reporters, education policymakers, and politicians to look backward skeptically on all the data used in shaping the D.C. public school policy and conclude that the entire portrait of district success was a sham and that many of the teachers and principals forced out of the system had been unjustly terminated. The portrait of the D.C. public schools as a great American success story was not only being undermined, it was being replaced by a narrative of which suggested that real D.C. public school story was one of ambition, profiteering, and careerism run amok at the expense of the city's black community, which not only tainted the engineers of school closings, teacher terminations, and charter promotions in D.C., but every foundation head, federal official, and local business leader who insisted these policies be extended to other cities. To reaffirm his portrait of a quote-unquote cover-up of corruption, inefficiency, and malfeasance in the D.C. public leadership, Jeff just sent me a 2009 report on the D.C. public schools by the Government Accountability Office, which has produced some of the Committee on Government Affairs and Homeland Security of the U.S. Senate. Those who produced this report were not critical of the most devastating consequences of the D.C. school reform, the closing or reorganization of nearly 50 schools and the removal of nearly 900 teachers, the majority of whom were black. What they were critical of was the absence of reliable data systems for evaluating teachers, a complete lack of accountability on the part of staff members in the DCPS, and the almost complete absence of input of teachers, parents, and community members into any policies relating to closing or transformation of schools. What came across in this report, produced nearly 9 years ago, now 12 years ago, was the extremely serious measures that affected the lives and careers of thousands of people and the education of tens of thousands of children were almost impossible to track systematically because there was little transparency or accountability in the manner in which they were implemented. Reading this report, not only for what it said, but for what could be read between the lines, it is utterly reprehensible that no serious investigation by local reporters or the U.S. Department of Education was launched in response. Clearly, federal officials, the Washington press, and education policymakers around the country had such a stake in the D.C. public school system, measures being a great American success story, that they overlooked problems that were in plain sight. The lesson here is devastating. To the degree that the policies currently being implemented in cities from L.A. to Miami to Chicago, Philadelphia, and Buffalo were justified by invoking the DCPS model, what has happened in those places is compromised as well, and if you look closely, you will see the same ugly dynamics: ethnic cleansing of teaching staffs, destabilization of neighborhoods, gentrification, and demographic inversion. Jeff Canady calls these policies eugenics. Given how much of what Jeff told us 10 years ago has turned out to be true, I am not about to say he is wrong. And that again was from Mark Naison, professor of, I believe, African American Studies at Fordham University. And let you know a little bit about Jeff and what the show will consist of. He kind of just jumped right in and gave us a history on eugenics. The show's going to start off with a clip that I actually got from in North Carolina in the 60s and 70s. They were removing the uteruses of like poor black women. And one woman had sued the state. And so we start the show off with her case. And then we go into it. So you're going to hear a clip first, and then we're going to go into the episode with Jeff Canady. So thank you for listening. And if you'd like to help the show grow and you feel so inclined, become a patron. It's easy. It's affordable. You'll get some merchandise. So if you want to be part of these conversations, click the link in the description to the YouTube channel and subscribe. And every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, we do a live stream. More often than not, we're going to have guests. It started off, the guests were only going to be on Tuesday, but as people couldn't make the Tuesday deadline because of, time zone scheduling, we're like, F it! We're going to have guests every time. So we've been having guests pretty much every time we do a live stream. We have a guest, and just recently this past Saturday, as I'm recording this on February 1st, we had Eddie Conway from The Real News, former Black Panther, was incarcerated for 43 years. That was actually a really good show. So, become a patron. You definitely get bonus content from a lot of these conversations. And you are helping the show grow, and you're helping it sustain itself. And subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get alerted whenever we do these live streams that are a lot of fun. So I will shut up and I will get into our conversation with, I almost called him eugenicist, Professor Jeff Canady, who's been an educator for, I believe, well over 30 years in the D.C. area. It's great, extensive knowledge on eugenics. Very interesting episode. I can't wait to hear your guys' comments and questions about this from the cats that didn't get to see the live stream. So thank you guys very much, and I am out.
Toward compensating victims of a sterilization program that lasted more than 4 decades. Ray Suarez has the story.
North Carolina was by no means the only state to have people sterilized against their will, but it was among the most aggressive in pursuing the policy. Roughly 7,600 people were sterilized between 1929 and 1974, many of them poor, sick, uneducated, or institutionalized, sometimes through force and coercion. The vast majority of the procedures took place in the years after World War II, when other states pulled back from such programs. The state apologized for the offenses in 2002. Today, a task force voted to pay the remaining living victims $50,000 apiece. We look at the history and today's decision with one of the principal activists working with the state's task force. Charmaine Fuller Cooper is the executive director of the State Foundation for Victims of Sterilization. Welcome to the program. How did North Carolina first get involved in sterilizing people?
North Carolina first became involved in the whole sterilization procedure at the height of eugenics in America. At the height of eugenics, we had approximately over 30 states that had sterilization programs or laws, with Indiana being the first state. Ironically, North Carolina actually didn't sterilize as many people in the early years like other states, but after World War II, North Carolina became very aggressive.
But after World War II, eugenics, that is, keeping people who are judged to be inferior from having children, was thoroughly discredited. How come North Carolina continued with the program for almost 30 years?
You know, it's very unexplainable in North Carolina why our program continued for another 30 years after other states had pretty much dismantled their program. And it's very horrifying and very shocking. And that's one of the reasons why North Carolina's governor and other people in the state are really working to gain justice for victims now.
Over the years, a lot of state employees, most notably social workers, judge people to be feeble-minded, epileptic, mentally diseased. Were these professionally qualified judgments? Were these people who were tested and screened, or just on the say-so of a social worker made unable to have children?
Many people were sterilized based on the say-so of social workers. Also, many people were given IQ tests, but we have to remember that these IQ tests were being given in North Carolina around the time that you had literacy tests being declared unconstitutional throughout the South.
Well, you got to know many of the victims over the years. Beyond the medical fact of not being able to be parents, what's the effect been on their lives?
You know, a lot of the victims are devastated. Many of them have had to heal in their own ways, but no victim is the same. Many victims have different stories to tell, and we have a lot of diverse victims within North Carolina, but the common thread is that many of them were targeted because of poverty.
Well, the survivors today, the class that's going to be compensated in this way, what's their age range, and what was the range of their ages when they were sterilized?
The age range of victims today, the youngest victim would be 50 years of age. The youngest victim who was sterilized within North Carolina was 10 years old at the time of the sterilization.
10 years old. Can you tell us the story that's involved there?
No, I don't have his specific story, but the stories throughout North Carolina range from people who thought they had their appendix removed and they found out later in life that they were actually sterilized. We also have individuals who they had children as a result of incest or rape, and immediately after they had their first child, they were raped. We have a lot of individuals who were sterilized as a condition of being released from a state institution.
So in some cases as a condition, so they knew what was happening to them. But for some, as you mentioned, told they were having their appendix out, they didn't know they were unable to bear children until many years later.
That is true. And even many of the people in state institutions didn't really realize the conditions. Some were told that they had to have a small procedure before they could come home. And for some of them, they found out later in life, both men and women, that that small procedure resulted in a long-term consequence of them never being able to bear children.
In this
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Tuesday live stream with This is Revolution podcast. That clip you saw, which is a very long clip, and I couldn't cut it up because I didn't make it, is from about a 10-year-old news piece about a lawsuit in North Carolina. And today's show is going to be about eugenics. And usually when we hear the word eugenics or when it's described, it's usually more often than not like in a science fiction movie, right? Always trying to make a bigger, better, more perfect person. Eugenics is defined as the social and political philosophy. It tries to influence the way people choose to mate and raise children with the aim of improving through human species. Let me introduce my co-host, my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert.
Jason Miles, good to see you. How you living, brother?
Pretty good. Is eugenics the science that will help us create a perfect person? Can eugenics tell us if people are predisposed to violence? Is it pseudoscience based in racism?
I think eugenics is best described as a pseudoscience used to excuse the function of capitalism, which is to eliminate as many people from the ability to facilitate access to income or capital. That eugenics is about maintaining hierarchy for the benefit of the ruling class.
Well, today, someone that actually knows way more about this than we do is Jeff Canady. He's the executive director of the Rebecca Project of Justice.
Okay.
Jeff!
Welcome. Hello, Jason. Hello, Pascal. Pleasure to be with you this evening.
Brother Jeff Canady. Brother Jeff.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Can I'd like to introduce to the audience how I first ran in or came to know Brother Jeff Canady, because I have a profound amount of affection for this brother, so I want to share.
Okay.
I wrote a piece for Black Agenda Report that at the time I didn't know was going to cause so much consternation. I wrote a piece called Black Eugenics, how the Black elite supported sterilization of the Black poor in the early 20th century. And what the piece was about how eugenics was an ideology that was used in the early 20th century, but how Black elites, or members of what was then called the Talented Tenth, used it as an internal racial purification mechanism to basically say that if you were a certain class of Black people, you need to be ethnically cleansed from the race via sterilization or internal marriage schemes so we could purify Black people. Even though many of those same actors would challenge racial eugenics programs that were applied to Black people, they supported class-based eugenics among Black people. And Jeff was one of the first people who came out and reached out to me and tell me, bro, you don't know what kind of a storm you created amongst this class of talented 10th type folk today. And he was explaining to me that this is a very hot subject and the importance of it. And I came to realize and appreciate the depth and the amount of time that Jeff had dedicated to studying eugenics, and that well surpassed my knowledge of the subject, and how he confronted it as an educator, how he called it out during the Obama administration with the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. And I want to start our interrogation through a simple, we're going to make this simple for our audience. Many people, Jeff, would find it difficult to believe, people who live under the mythology that America is a democratic society and the land of the free, home of the brave, that a race-based sterilization program where we tried to exterminate certain people, certain types of poor people, certain types of Black people, brown people, Latino women, could be practiced in American society to the point where, in some ways, it's being reinvigorated in our society today. Can you explain to us the ideological origins and foundations of eugenics for our audience, please? Can you take it to a basic level for us?
Okay, let me just start here. Eugenics was basically a word that was coined by a British aristocrat who was the second cousin of Charles Darwin. I think everyone knows about Darwin's Species of Man that came out in late 18th century, late 19th century. And in 1883, Francis Galton coined this frame called eugenics, well-born, essentially. And what he was trying to do was to explain how the British society, him and his friends, him and his everyone he lived around at that particular time, were superior to everyone else. So he took all these racist ideas and turned it into a word called eugenics. Later on, in the beginning of the 20th century, based on Gregory Mendel's Pease study, American Human Betterment League, they started the American Eugenic Society in the beginning of the 20th century. The Eugenic Society would have been just some quack idea if it had not been for the funding of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Harriman Foundation. It was supported by J.P. Morgan. Eugenics was almost a religion for the first 40 years of the 20th century in America. It only fell out of favor when the Nazis came to America, learned from the Californians and the Virginians this ideology and used it as against the Jews during World War II. This is something that the Americans supported. This was something that the Americans paid for. This is well documented. I mean, anyone can look this information up. One book, Hitler's American Model, by a Yale Law School professor, Whitman. You can look in Kennedy's Stamp from the Beginning. He outlines that. I think it's in another one of Kennedy's book where he may outline this particular history in how to be an anti-racist. This is where we get standardized tests. This is where we get our criminal justice programs. This is where we get our housing policy. This is where we get our economic policy. All roads leads to eugenics. And how I came about eugenics was basically I was educated through standardized testing. And when I was younger, and then I have to go way back, when I was younger, there was a famous psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. named Dr. Francis Quest Welsing. And Dr. Welsing was debating on a show where my cousin was the producer of the Tony Brown Journal.
What?
And I was about 9 years old, and she was debating William Shockley. I never forget it, about a subject called eugenics. And they was discussing dysgenic, and that's when you find that somebody is not well born and you systematically try to wipe them out. And Shockley was trying to explain how the Black community was dysgenic. And Francis Welsing just completely destroyed him on Tony Brown Journal. Anyone can go to YouTube. I think that clip is still up. Matter of fact, I know it's still up. And look back in that was in about 1973. So I was about 9 years old or about that time. And I used to talk from Dr. Welsing all the time. I formerly worked at the DC City Council for the chair of the Judiciary Committee, who was actually the founder of the National Association of Black Women Attorneys, Wilhelmina Rolark. And I used to talk, just in the community to Dr. Welsing all the time. We used to meet, and she would always tell me that one day you're going to be teaching about eugenics. You're going to be, and I was like, oh, no. And when I was in undergrad, I started writing racism. I was the general manager of school newspaper that won actual two national awards, the two top national awards in in different acts. And, we would talk about eugenics in class in Eastern North Carolina. A lot of times people did not know the subject matter in which we were speaking on, but it's not a secret. One of the things that you can look at if you really want to familiarize what's going on in eugenics right now is a documentary that came out in late November on PBS called Belly of the Beast. And this is about sterilizations that occurred in California prisons. And I think about that time, Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of the state of California, not suggesting that she had anything to do with it. But they just stopped sterilizing women in California prisons maybe in 2014. So all the way up to the Obama administration, they were still sterilizing people. And in Washington, D.C., what occurred was we had someone named Michelle Rhee, who became the chancellor of D.C. public schools. And after Adrian Fenty took over, and they instituted standardized testing in the district as a punishment against teachers and a punishment. And standardized teaching has always been known as a eugenic tool against minorities. You can look that up. That is common knowledge. It was started doing the alpha and the beta test during World War I that we're giving. In 1917, they were trying to figure out who would be able to shoot the heavy weapon, and then they were giving people these diagnostic terms: low-grade moron, high-grade moron, imbecile, idiot. This is where all these words come from. So even if we want to talk about in popularity in terms of our culture right now, if you look at Trump and former President Trump, thank God he's going to be former president tomorrow. His biographer wrote that Trump was a eugenicist, and he talked about how Trump believed in blood in the theory. And you can just Google Trump and eugenics, and you'll see all of these articles, all these scholarly articles that would come up.
Isn't one of those people that injects himself with the blood of like younger people to try to feel and stay younger? Isn't he one of those people?
Now that one I'm not too sure of, but
no, I'm not sure
blood boy
Trump is into that. But I do know that Trump talks about how it's in the blood, certain people.
Yeah. Well, it's actually in his genes. That's what you have to realize. This is something that began in the beginning of the 20th century, where the richest people in the country, they were facing a crisis around capitalism. And you have to remember, America was a deeply unequal society. Black folks were just coming out of slavery, and the capitalists in that particular period of time, we're talking about the J.P. Morgans, the Harrimans, once again, the Carnegies, the richest people in the country. They came up with, well, what are we going to do? People were demanding weekends. They were demanding labor rights. They were trying to do something about this crushing capitalism that was killing them. And what they came up with was this ideology.
So in other words,
instead of it was capitalism that was crushing the American society, why don't we just make it about heredity? That it wasn't that the economic system in America was crushing you. It was your family. It was your blood. It was in your genes. So if your family wasn't doing well, it had nothing to do with the economic system of the country. It had everything to do with the triflingness that flowed down in the blood of your genes. So if your father was an alcoholic, you were going to be an alcoholic. Like if your mother was a prostitute, you were going to be a prostitute. If your mother was working in someone's house as a maid, you were going to be a maid, because those things were predetermined, what was called biological determinism. And we have been fighting biological determinism for over 100 years in this country. So when we start talking about the twins of segregation, the twin evils of segregation and separation in this country, segregation is not a legal term. Segregation is a scientific term. It came from the eugenics movement. So we'll go all the way to the 1927 Buck versus Bell. I want people to look this up. Supreme Court decision. Oliver Holmes made a decision, 8-1. Supreme Court decision, Buck versus Bell, 1927, saying three generations of imbeciles are enough. That law is still on the books. I want people to look that up. I want people to look up the 1924 Racial Identity Act in the state of Virginia. And so in the 1924 Immigration Act, that did not change. That did not change until 1965. And it stopped Jews and people coming from Southern Europe coming to the country, because United States they were thinking that they were letting too many people into the country. So these were all of the same things that Donald Trump just got finished giving us 4 years of, to the extreme. So now that you can clearly see what it is, and I think you're showing a picture of Adam Cohen. He made a recent book on eugenics right there called Imbeciles. He was editor of the New York Times. You can find it in books like Dr. Chantella Sherman, who's one of my favorites, In Search of Purity. This is a book by Stephen Selden, Inheriting Shame, out of the University of Maryland. So the thing that struck me was, and I did most of my researching on eugenics at Georgetown Law School. My mother had just died, and I was about to get into the bioethics program at Columbia University. And once my mother died, I just had to take a pause. And so I was studying at Georgetown Law, and I was just amazed at how many books was in the library, just whole sections that I used to bring people to the library and just show them whole sections of books on the study of eugenics. Not only did Georgetown have a whole section of books on eugenics, they had a whole library on the first floor of Healy on the main campus in the bioethics library, dedicated on the sole subject of eugenics, a whole library. So once you discovered and you started reading this material, you started realizing how long and how wide this has been going on. PBS did a special on eugenics called, let me see, 2 years ago. It was called.
I know the one you're talking about. I actually just
Eugenics Crusade. Eugenics Crusade
yeah.
about 2 years ago. Belly of the Beast once again came out on about November the 23rd. That was on PBS. You can look up A Dangerous Idea. All of these are documentaries on eugenics, and this was done and sponsored by the Constitution Center, which Joe Biden was the president, not the president emeritus at that particular time, where they look at the issues that affect the Constitution. And anyone can look this up online. There are links. A Dangerous Idea, where in the University of Pennsylvania sponsored a seminar on this in 2016. And last year, Duke University Center discussed how in North Carolina, and I think that's what your video led on to, how they committed a program of eugenic genocide against the Black folks in North Carolina. And one of the most amazing facts that I've discovered in discussing eugenics was, was that the Tuskegee experiments that came out of Alabama was part of the eugenic experiments. It happened in 7 more places during the South. But these experiments came from professors.
Did it last for as long as Tuskegee? The other ones?
I'm not sure how long the other 7 lasted, but they were in different places throughout the South. But those experiments came from professors from the University of Virginia, which was known as the home of Southern eugenics. So when you look at the Charlottesville riots, what you'll discover is this ideology was at the core of what was going on in Charlottesville. It's been at the core of Trump's wall. The first time discussing putting up a wall around the southern border was not new. It happened during the eugenics movement. And that fact bears out when you look at PBS's American Experience, the Eugenics Crusade. So all of these things are linked online. You can take a look at. And I actually had an opportunity to work on national legislation on eugenics, the treatment of certain payments that allowed the people in only 2 states, Virginia and North Carolina, that have given eugenic compensation money for people being forcefully sterilized, many against their will, and many without their knowledge of knowing they have been sterilized. One of my good friends who was a partner with me in the Rebecca Project, Elaine Riddick, you can look at her story on ABC. She's been interviewed everywhere from Anderson Cooper to NBC, ABC, internationally known for her eugenic sterilization story. That those links are online. And what's amazing, and to this day, and I always show my friends and my neighbors, and of course my family, that how much and how many articles are written on a weekly basis about eugenics. I know the Washington Post has written in the last 3 years at least 20 stories about eugenics. So if you just Google, and don't even have to do a very high scholarly look, you'll see all of these articles about how eugenics affects different aspects of the American society. So what we have now with the Biden administration, I had a friend, Dr. Denisha Jones, you can look on MSNBC, and she asked President-elect Biden about standardized testing in eugenics at the MSNBC forum. Look at his answer. Can you post that, Jason? I think you can find that online.
Joe, do you know what year that was?
This was in 2019. This was in December of 2019.
Okay. So he was still running for office then? Yes.
He was at the NBC Education Forum. She asked him about standardized testing. And he made the promise to end standardized testing. I think there's a story on the National Review that's online, and I think there's another link online with the video of him actually discussing this subject matter. So this is not so. And remember, President Obama signed the treatment of certain payments on October the 7th, 2016. You can look that up online. And what was amazing about when President Obama signed the treatment of certain payments, he did it without comment. And that same weekend, he went to a campaign rally for Hillary Clinton down in somewhere in Eastern North Carolina, I believe it was, or middle of North Carolina. And he did not mention one single word about signing this legislation. And you would think that someone running for president, trying to help someone running for president of the United States would tell the state that I just helped about 4,000 or 5,000 people in your state receive compensation for a genocide program that was promoted directly against the Black folks in the state. And this is something else that we really get an opportunity to correct. When eugenics first started, it wasn't necessarily against Black folks. It was used against poor people. Poor people, period. Matter of fact, Blacks weren't even allowed into the institutions that they were actually sterilizing people initially. When it fell out of favor during World War II is when they started a whole new round of eugenics. So if you look at A Dangerous Idea, you'll see where they'll talk about the first round of eugenics where about 70 to 80,000 Americans were sterilized. But then they'll talk about this period in the 60s where about 800 or 600 to 800,000 Americans, another round, were sterilized. So you ask, okay, well, how come I've never heard of this? Well, I think there are about 9 states where they actually teach in high school about eugenics. But you got to remember, this was done by the richest people in the country, and they simply wiped it out of history. I think it was no less than 3 weeks ago, and you can Google this, search whatever your engine is. The Carnegie Foundation apologized after years of denying their involvement with eugenics. They just apologized 3 weeks ago. So you had the University of London, City of London, where Galton was a professor. They just apologized for eugenics 2 weeks ago. Harvard apologized for eugenics 4 years ago. Stanford apologized for eugenics in about the last 3 or 4 years. There was an article about Caltech that came out this week where they're removing the names of 6 eugenicists off their buildings. So in California, you will see a lot of the schools are actually removing names of eugenicists. Woodrow Wilson was a eugenicist, and that's the thing that I think we need to just sit in. Calvin Coolidge was a eugenicist. Eugenics was almost a religion in the beginning of the 20th century again. And I remember when Pascal introduced me earlier, I took a class from Cornell West. Basically, I was looking at that time based upon what Pascal had wrote about W.E. Du Bois and his relationship with eugenics. And I found something absolutely amazing. So if you look at the book, The Philadelphia Negro, which was one of Du Bois's first book, he'll have these eugenic, essentially, labels for folks.
Yes.
So you have the talented temp, but you have the submerged temp. These are the never-do-gooders in society, those who have never done well, and how he outlined how they wanted to systematically wipe them out. But what occurred around Du Bois was a complete shift. So by the 1920s, Du Bois was number one enemy of the eugenic movement. He actually debated in a great scholarly debate in Chicago, eugenicist named Lawford Stoddard. And I would like everyone to look that up, the debate between W. Du Bois and Lawford Stoddard. So what you have is people like Madison Grant, whose father name was Gabriel Grant, who was a Medal Honor winner, who was a surgeon who cut off General Otis Howard's arm, and who was the founder of Howard University and also in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau. So eugenics was not only accepted and practiced for different reasons by Black folks in the beginning of the 20th century, it never actually went away. It never actually went away.
Mr. Canady, what do you think was Du Bois's impetus to shift away from eugenics?
Well, from my research and from everything that I've learned, and what you saw was a shift. Now, at the time that Du Bois went to Harvard, being the first African American to matriculate from Harvard, being allowed to matriculate from Harvard with a PhD, there was this teaching and around African Americans and about poor people being subhuman. That was part of the American culture. Mm-hmm. And as you started seeing in the beginning of the 20th century, as it was being directed more toward African Americans, Du Bois started asking, what is it about these standardized tests that lead people beyond being human? Mm-hmm. And what you have in the beginning of the 21st century was Michelle Rhee and Kaya Henderson, who were supporting standardized testing all across the country as a new form of the eugenics movement. And we have already known for 100 years, these standardized tests came from people like Yerkes, Robert Yerkes, and other Stanford professors. Stanford was founded on Stanford's first president was a well-known eugenicist who came from Indiana University. They just taken his name off of buildings at Indiana University now. So what you have is this national movement where people are starting to look at eugenics and start to ask questions, especially around the issue of vaccinations right now. And I'm not going to get stuck on that right now, but I would ask anybody to look up eugenics and vaccinations. One of the most remarkable things I've done in looking at how do systematic racism and the proliferation of eugenics in our society in different ways, whether it be through transhumanism, whether it's through biotechnology, whether it's through our economic policy, the Keynesian economic policies. Who was the leader in the British eugenics movement. So you had in Britain right now, you have people who are embracing the name of Maurice Stopes. And of course, one of the biggest ones in this country was the denial that Margaret Sanger was eugenist. That was just absolutely ridiculous. So Planned Parenthood only in this year came and removed Margaret Sanger's name because of her relationship with eugenics. So when we look at this, and I wanted to go back to something around the standardized testing issue, because I'm an educator at heart, and that's how I found myself.
I definitely want to ask you about this. Sorry to cut you off, because you mentioned someone's name that actually it brings up a lot of ire in especially in this space, which is Ibrahim X. Kendi. I don't look at him with the same amount of disdain that a lot of others do, because of his work with when it comes to kind of calling out standardized testing. Do you also get into, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates also pushed really hard standardized testing?
Oh, they put $200 million in the Common Core,
which is all the. And for any parents out there watching, that's a big reason why your kids do Common Core is because of Bill Gates.
Bill and Melinda Gates put $200 into Common Core. So you got to look at people like Eli Broad, who has a foundation and is a big contributor to Johns Hopkins and Harvard. You got to look at the relationship of the Broad Foundation when it comes to educating educators all across the country, and look and see where else this money is flowing. You got to look at what we call right now, we're in this country, is what's called the second Gilded Age. So during the first Gilded Age is when they basically came up with eugenics and put it in society to save capitalism. So now we're in the second Gilded Age, the era of big technology, and where all this big tech is coming. And the eugenic thought that is behind a lot of this big tech. And I'm not saying the technology is evil by any means, but as Martin Luther King so potently talked about scientific racism in his work. And, we just are leaving the Martin Luther King holiday yesterday. And you don't hear a lot of talk about that segregation that Martin Luther King was fighting against the entire international eugenics movement. It was done all across the world, not just in America. So right now, you can Google and look up the fact that Japan is trying to settle or compensate eugenic sterilization victims. That is an issue in Sweden. That is an issue in India. And that is an issue in China. China's one-child policy is a eugenic concept. So then when we start, once again, talking about 21st century issues like transhumanism is a form of 21st century eugenics. And what does that mean for average everyday Black folks? How do people see you? You know, how do people see your role going on in the future? So in many movies that you'll see these eugenic concepts, Dr. Chantella Sherman has done an excellent job of looking at movies and finding eugenics through different movies. And I would advise anyone to look up Dr. Chantella, some of her YouTube explorations of the subject of eugenics. She's a scholar that got her PhD out of the University of Nebraska. And I remember when I was in Cornell West class, and he was saying some things, I was like, wait a minute, and had to have a hard conversation with him. You know, he took me to dinner for about 3 hours, and he was calling me regularly, to take a look at this research. It was so absolutely groundbreaking. So, as a society, we have to continuously fight against this idea of biological determinism, about the turn of about every 10 years or so. These racist ideas, and this is going to be one of the main issues of the Biden administration. And a lot of times people would like to separate and say, well, it's just the Republicans doing this. No. Or it's just the Democrats. No, it's the Republicans, Democrats. It don't matter if you're a socialist, communist. Eugenics don't care about your ideology. It doesn't care about your personal politics. It transcends all of this. And to see it practiced on the micro level in actual families, where people will make eugenic comments about their own family members that some kind of way, because of a parent or because of a particular sibling, that the children are not doing particularly well, that it's in their genes, that it's in their blood. I mean, these are type of common comment or thinking. And then to turn whole school neighborhoods into what they used to call minded schools by labeling them like they have in Washington, D.C. They have schools that have a numeric system that's based on eugenics, where they have whole schools, whole communities, where they make people believe that all of their schools are bad, and that none of the students, these communities, zero, are college and career bound. That's insane. And I've worked those communities and sent more students to law school, to medical school, than anybody maybe in the history of the District of Columbia as a teacher. So, this, and you got to look at the fast fired teachers across the country in the system. I mean, in Atlanta, they were locking teachers up. And I think most of you in Atlanta, they wanted to teachers with RICO for
cheating on those tests. Yeah.
On standardized racist eugenic tests. Now, how insane is that? And in the District of Columbia, they had an even bigger scandal. They gave those teachers awards, financial awards that counted toward their retirement bonus money. So in Atlanta, you had teachers going to jail for cheating on standardized tests. You had the same situation in Washington. Anybody can look this information up and see that in Washington, they gave the teachers bonus money that counted toward their retirement for cheating on these standardized testing. They had an even larger scandal in Washington, D.C. So, I remember a few years ago working on the lead war occurred, a hearing I was teaching Bible study. I've been doing that for years through the U.S. Senate Chaplain's Office. And went to minister to the people from my surprise when I was in that hearing about the Flint lead water situation. They weren't talking about lead water from Flint. They were talking about lead water from Washington, D.C. And I'm sitting there scratching my head like, what in the world, And come to find out that Washington, D.C. had an even bigger lead water problem than Flint. Anyone can Google that information. Just put in Washington, D.C. lead water. So from that hearing, from sitting in that hearing for a few hours, I went and asked city leaders about the problem. And the first thing I got was, no, there's no lead problem in Washington. I say, well, wait a minute, I just went to a hearing on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue where national experts were saying that it was. Well, that next week, about 3 days later, the mayor's office came out and said that they hadn't reported to 3 Capitol Hill schools that the children had been drinking their water. So when they actually went back and looked at that, and eventually did 20 radio shows. You can go back and Google those. A lot of those radio shows are still online. 20 radio shows on the issue of lead water. By the 4th or 5th radio show, we had the head of DC Water in the studio trying to explain what was going on. And they actually changed the law. But what they found was that lead was in almost 70 to 80% of the schools in the District of Columbia and had been that way for years.
Jesus.
And I started actually working on the lead water situation to get away from eugenics. But then one day I just Googled lead water and eugenics. And guess what came up? The British Eugenic Society discussing lead. There was a story about the diachylon pill, which was the first pill used for abortion in England and later in America, which was made out of lead. And so there's a reason why they put lead in all the piping system all throughout in the late 18th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, all the way all throughout America, even though they knew it was a deadly neurotoxin. So you can find a lot of that in the Great Lead Water Pipe Disaster by Wayne Trotsky out of the University of Pittsburgh. And what you'll see is this continuing ideology of eugenics that affects everything in American life.
Pascal, you look like you have a follow-up question.
Brother Jeff, that was a phenomenal presentation, brother. That was I knew you were going to bring the pain, but I didn't know you were going to bring the pain like that. And when you brought the pain, but why? I'll be very honest to you. I became alive to eugenics as a result of that piece that I wrote. And in increasing conversations with you, I realized that this has been a ruling class power elite agenda in America for over 100 years.
Yes.
Why has there not been a collective cri de guerre, call to arms by social justice networks, the civil rights establishment, C'est la vie, so on and so forth, et cetera, to make this subject, eugenics, enemy number one is society? Is it perhaps that they get similar funding from these actors as well that are the capitalist philanthropies that might be funding these programs on the other side? Maybe I'm being too conspiratorial or distrustful.
No, that's not a conspiracy. That's not a conspiracy. That's looking to see where people traditionally got their funding from. If you look at the NAACP, not only embraced the early NAACP, not only embraced eugenics, they used to have their beauty contests, the pageants that they had was sponsored by fitter families and doing things around fitter families and eugenics. That's how they raised money for their lynching campaign. So you see what you understand when you go back into this history, not just to point out the NAACP, but you got to remember Eugenics was thought to be a religion. It was in 80 or 90% of the textbooks up until the 1940s. It was a widely accepted science, and people thought it was a science, even though we now know it as a pseudoscience, a set of racist beliefs. But the power that it has, and the reason why it keeps transcending, is because they want people to believe that some kind of way that we can always become something more than human. And that is the power of the belief that man can make man better than God. And that we can be more. So if you look up when you look up transhumanism, what you'll understand is this ideology just didn't start in the last 20 years. This goes back 100 years. What they did not have was the technology. So if you look at technology now, especially around gene splicing, around CRISPR-9, if you just look at the whole argument around genes and the Human Genome Project, which was explored beautifully in the documentary A Dangerous Idea. You know, one of the things, and I'm gonna regress from that conversation for a second, just to discuss A Dangerous Idea. When you look at Van Jones and Robert Reich, and they're discussing eugenics in a documentary where Robert Reich is basically talking about how the Clinton administration embrace eugenics and put it into public policy. This is Clinton's Secretary of Labor. I mean, and this is being discussed at the University of Pennsylvania. It's being discussed at Stanford. It's being discussed at Georgetown. It's being discussed at all, Indiana University, all these universities around the country. But why is it not, as you said, why is it not a household issue? Why isn't? Because the richest people in the country, once again, were the ones who promoted it and who some are still promoting it.
I have that clip ready if you guys want to look at that clip of Joe Biden talking about standardized education.
Yeah, there we go. Denisha, let's go.
I want to hear you guys. I want to hear your comment on this.
Yeah.
Action,
Can you hear?
Early years, the
Yes.
Badass Teachers Association, and the National Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action Steering Committee. Teaching has changed drastically over the last 10 to 20 years. Instead of being allowed to use their expertise to develop engaging curriculum that's culturally responsive, teachers are often forced to use a scripted curriculum that rushes children through without giving them enough time to really understand the material. Many teachers feel more like a test prep tutor than a test of children, and they're concerned that both teachers and students are heavily evaluated by standardized testing. Beginning in kindergarten, young children are losing time for play and discovery and instead forced into developmentally inappropriate academic instruction in an effort to get them prepared for tests. Although formal testing does not begin until third grade, younger students are often bombarded with practice tests that narrow the curriculum and often leave them hating school. Given that standardized testing is rooted in a history of racism and eugenics, if you are elected president, will you commit to ending the use of standardized testing in public schools?
Yes.
If you do standardized tests, you ain't black.
As one of my friends and black pastors, I spent a lot of time, Reverend Henry would say, you're preaching to the choir, kid, okay? Because look, that's why teachers should be able to determine the curricula in their schools. I mean, I'm not being nice.
Black teachers.
I'm not trying to be nice.
Almost as good as white
lousy
teachers.
teachers out there, okay? There's lousy politicians.
Now
There's
what we
lousy
need to
senators.
do is to
There's
look at what
lousy doctors. I'm not saying every teacher's a
Here, I'll
great
stop
teacher.
it.
Joe
What I'm
Biden's
saying
position
is,
is currently.
you know.
Well, isn't he right now? Isn't he not really committing what he's going to do with standardized testing, or has he said that he's going to keep it?
Well, clearly he committed to ending standardized testing right there in that particular clip. I mean, there's no inequivocation in that statement. You know, his answer was clearly, yes, we need to end standardized testing. Let's see what he has done around making his decision for his new Secretary of Education. Let's see what he does around standardized testing for this upcoming school year. Let's see what he does. And when you look at the relationship between some of Biden's cabinet members, I know Nita Tandon, I believe it is, the Office of
Nita Tandon,
yeah, Nita Tandon. I was watching her just this week, and she described coming to America, and one of the reasons why her family was able to come to America because of the Johnson administration, 1965, changing once again the 1924 Immigration Act, which is the crowning achievement of the American eugenic movement. So she's discussing that from a standpoint of her family was able to come to this country by changing the eugenic law that had stood on the books for 40 years. So, that is the powerful effect. And once anybody starts interacting or looking at what Frances Cress Welsing was saying about eugenics and what people have been saying about eugenics for the last years, there's whole libraries of information. And I'm actually writing my book right now. Don't hold me to how soon I'm going to finish it. You know how that goes. And we'll understand it. And one of the things about my personal story, and I'll explain to this, I was about to be National Teacher of the Year, and this is undisputed. I was named before I was 35, to be on the board that ran actual DC public schools. I had the endorsements of local newspapers, the City Paper, the Washington Post, to be on the school board of the District of Columbia. I was trained by Harvard, and the District of Columbia government actually sent me to 2 graduate schools to pay for 2 masters. So I was one of the top teachers, not only in the city, but one of the top Black teachers, and still am, in the country. And I was summarily fired by the DC public schools without any due process. And my case didn't come up for years. 9 years, right? There's actually a Washington Post article. Lots of Washington Post. And the city actually had to pay me millions of dollars. And what they did was, not only did they pay me millions of dollars, but they tried to get me to sign over my legal rights not to sue them further. And when I didn't do it, guess what they did? Fired me again. I mean, you can't make this kind of stuff up, regardless of how public it was, how insane it was. And by this time I had senators writing the mayor. I had the U.S. Senate chaplain writing the mayor. I mean, and it was widely known. This is something the city council members was writing, the particular mayor in the District of Columbia. So now we're back into that particular cycle. And the city has already paid me millions and still violating my rights because of the fact that I will not stop talking about standardized testing and eugenics.
That's insane that there's the pushback on standardized testing seems to be so light, because also too, if it feels like it's a factor in like where you live, right? When you look at schools,
yes,
isn't it the easiest way to judge schools and a school district? I went to a high school, shout out Albany High in Albany, California, small town, 1 square mile, but great test scores, great school.
Well, you got to remember, I was one of the leaders of Opt Out, and Dr. Denisha Jones, who you showed, she was another leader of Opt Out in the clip earlier, asking President-elect Biden about standardized testing. I remember when Dr. Jones was a professor at Howard, and I was broaching with her about the issue of eugenics. She really didn't know what eugenics was, and we had to go through this process. I had to go through this process of explaining and sitting down with her and others and explaining to them what eugenics was. So you have all of these people who have, and she has moved to not only learning what eugenics is, but teaching about it at a very high level.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this process, and we have all of these African Americans who have a PhD in particular sciences. where their learning has been, some of the gaps have not been filled in around some of the historical ideas that many of the things they've learned, where they came from. And when you do the research, you'll find out that they're white supremacist ideas from the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. And
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go.
Sorry, now I lost my train of thought because somebody just put a question in. He's Brian Annan. Am I saying it? Annan says, my wife has railed against the standardized test for years. It totally screws the curriculum and benefits no one except politicers and school board trustees who want to flaunt their numbers.
Well, that's the amazing thing. That's why I tell people to read Dr. Stephen Selden. I mean, these are things that people like the historian from Florida, the one that dated Langston Hughes.
You're talking about she was an anthropologist.
Zora Neale Hurston.
Oh, Zora Neale Hurston. Okay.
Yeah, she was an anthropologist, and she was studying the eugenic effect. And that's what she was studying through anthropology through Francis Bois. Bois was a ardent opponent of Madison Grant. Madison Grant is known as one of America's greatest racists. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great White Race. The Passing of the Great White Race. And Hitler wrote Madison Grant and said that this book was his Bible. And I need people to look this information up. And I spoke about him earlier. His father, Gabriel Grant, had won the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Fair Oaks during the Civil War. So when people start reading about Madison Grant and they start looking at what was going on between Marcus Garvey, Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington at that particular time, and they start reading Dr. Chanteller Sherman and started understanding Booker T. Washington was the only Black at the first Eugenics International Conference.
The first American Eugenics Conference meeting in America.
Yeah. There was only one. There was only
Booker T.
Black person. And
what was his stance? Was his stance kind of the same?
He wasn't there to protest.
No, he wasn't. He was there. He was receiving the money from this is in 1914. This is in 1914. So you can start understanding and reframing the debates. And that's one thing that Abram Kendi, and I know some of you said some of your listeners may not be that fond of Kendi, but that's one of the things he brought out beautifully and stamped from the beginning.
Yeah.
Stamped from the beginning, that particular section about the eugenic debate between Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. And once people start understanding that it was the eugenicists of that particular time, the racist eugenicists of Virginia who got Marcus Garvey out of jail. And if you go back and look into a lot of the information that was given out between the Garvey outs at that particular time, this eugenic language is in there. And why? Because Garvey wanted to separate from the races. And that
he had his own form of racial purity.
Yes.
On blackening
and
the
that perfectly, yes. And that perfectly lined up with the eugenicists. So they supported Garvey. And so when you go to some of these Black leaders, you'll start seeing that some of the money that they have gotten have come from these white supremacists who wanted to separate Blacks from whites. Loving versus Virginia, 1967, was in the Supreme Court decision that changed eugenic law. And I want any law professor or any law scholar to look it up. If you look at Oklahoma versus Skinner, is another Supreme Court decision. 1942, another Supreme Court decision around eugenics is Buck versus Bell, 1927. I have a law professor who's on the DC City Council, and she actually wanted to argue with me about standardized testing and eugenics. It's insane. And Union Theological, they have a class on eugenics. And 2 law professors at Georgetown University teach on eugenics. There are plenty of professors across the country who have not only in their curriculum, but they have whole classes on eugenics. So you have people like Dr. Preston Reynolds at University of Virginia Medical School, Gregory Dorr. You have people like Paul. Oh my God, I can't think of Paul's name right now at Georgia State University, who spent their entire career writing about eugenics. And like I said, Adam Cohen, who you showed earlier, former editor of the New York Times, just won a couple of awards. So when you start talking about things like Oten Bega being in the Bronx Zoo, and people like Pamela Newkirk writing about eugenics and why, you start talking about people like Toni Morrison, who wrote in The Origin of Others, the eugenics of Samuel Cartwright and Drake to Mania. You're going to find this constant theme of eugenics all throughout American literature, all throughout American history, and all throughout American scholarship.
Oh, incredible. Well, brother, I think we covered a lot of details here. This is a great introduction, and we're a little bit over an hour. What do you think, Jason?
Well, is there anything you want to plug?
Yeah, do you have any appearances, articles, locations you're speaking at, events that your organization is sponsoring that you want to plug while you're here? Jeff?
No, not at this time right now. Like I said, I am busy working on legal battles with the District of Columbia government, who want to sponsor eugenics to standardize testing, and it's completely insane. I am still ministering through the Senate with the police officers and the different battles that had accidents that have just recently occurred through there.
Are you still in DC?
I'm still in Washington D.C. Yes,
So you're dealing with the officers that were involved in. I mean, this might want to be. Didn't even ask you about this. So you're dealing with officers that were dealing with that riot on the 6th.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And
so there's an real quick, and I hope this doesn't. I'm not trying to anger you in any sort of way. There's a lot of people that say that a lot of the officers that were involved were part of the people that were rioting, and you totally disagree with that.
No, I didn't say I disagreed with that.
Okay.
What I said was I'm ministering to some Capitol Hill officers.
Oh, okay.
I think what we had was people who have white supremacist ideas on both sides. Mm-hmm. And white supremacy is a problem within this country. And once you get into the eugenic tropes, you will see how much and how deeply the rabbit hole goes. And it's not as though the media is trying to hide. I mean, you can just look at how many articles the New York Times, the Washington Post, California newspapers. There's legislation right now in California to compensate individuals who've been sterilized by the state. And you've had the states I think you've had maybe 8 to 12 states apologize for eugenics, starting with Virginia with Governor Warren. Governor Mark Warren, when he was governor, who's now a United States senator, and that is one of the little more the difficult aspects of it, because you'll have people who have actually apologized and worked on eugenic issues, like Senator Tillis in North Carolina, mm-hmm. and what they need to do is to redouble their efforts to go a little further. I want to say this, and it's something I discussed with Pascal. I met through protest and working through opt-out with a young man just on online named Jamal Bowman, who just got elected
congressman
in New York. Yeah. Part of Jamal's dissertation that he discussed with me repeatedly was on eugenics in education. That was part of his dissertation, and he spoke out fervently about the Trump's administration involvement in eugenics and how it affected his response to COVID. So now he is in Congress. What is he specifically going to do around the particular issue of eugenics? And that's something that we're going to have an opportunity not only to push him on, but to ask him and others to respond to. This isn't some pseudoscience that people are trying to hide. This is something that's openly discussed, all throughout the country.
It's I think it's an important discussion because I like to see how people handle it when you start saying, well, standardized testing is a problem. And so many people that have built the value of their neighborhood or their zip code on the standardized test scores of their school.
Right. I mean,
how does it back on that?
Right. How does it affect your economics when your school is built? The economic value of your community is built on your schools, and the schools is based on white supremacy policy. That's insane. I mean, but that's what we have all throughout America. So, we need at this particular time to push this particular issue, to ask our leaders, what is their understanding of the issue, to have it being taught at a very early age. I would say even as early as 3 and 4 years old in early childhood education, which I am an early childhood educator, so that people will be able to always be able to articulate when they're dealing with eugenic thoughts, with eugenic beliefs in their interactions between each other, their personal and their professional and professional life.
Jeff, I would simply want to ask is that, would you be willing to come back on our show?
Oh, absolutely.
Conversations on this. I think this has been an excellent introduction to our audience on the subject, which was really all we were aiming for, quite frankly, because the subject is so deep. But we really would like to interrogate furthermore about capitalism, eugenics, its purposes, and why it's being revived today by forces of not only the ruling class, but educational forces. Why is Charles Murray still around? I mean, we could talk. We didn't
even get to the bell curve, which is so funny. This whole conversation.
We haven't even gotten to the American Enterprise Institute and the bell curve.
Yeah,
I mean, these are not. This is once again. This is not a hidden science. It's out there, right in front of your face to see. And this is what Democrats and Republicans have been pushing in our national legislation for years.
It's a bipartisan consensus, and brother, we really, really have brought us to understand what we're up against, and we look forward to having you on again.
All right, I look forward to being
on. Enjoy being on our program, and we look forward to having you on again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
All right,
and I truly appreciate you coming on here. Thank you very much.
All right, it's good to see you, Jason.
Hey, nice to meet you.
All right,
have a good one. Wow. He came with some heat. I hope you guys appreciate that. I appreciated that. And we didn't even scratch the surface because we definitely didn't even get into the bell curve discussion. We definitely didn't even really get into the IQ discussion. So we need to do a part 1 and part 2. We definitely need to do a part 1 and part 2. Political Pain, Joe Payne says, thank you for dedicating an episode to this topic. It's very important to fit people. What are you saying? To fit people or to get people to understand this disgusting policy set in the United States. Exactly. And you know what's funny? The last conversation I heard about anything to do with this was probably a few weeks ago or a month ago. They said that they were taking out the uteruses of some of those women in the prisons, in the immigration prisons, which is fucking horrible. But if Jeff is still around, another part of this show is we try to have a little bit of fun. That was very heavy. Can you still hear us, Jeff? Are you still there?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay.
Before we go there, I want your listeners to look at Belly of the Beast, which actually discuss what you just discussed. That's the documentary that came out about California women in prisons recently on PBS. And they were taking out their uteruses without their permission, sterilizing them all the way up to 2014. So yeah, we need to talk about IQ which is a eugenic concept. The bell curve, which was written by people who was straight funded by the eugenics movement, the American Enterprise Institute, their relationship with eugenics. We need to talk about different funders of eugenics, whether it's ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and their relationship with eugenics. So yeah, I mean, we can have fun with it, but this is something that's not going anywhere right now.
And so, Political Pain, Joe Payne. Shout out to Joe Payne. I was on his show recently, so shout out to Joe Payne. Years ago, the IDW clown Sam Harris was trying to rehabilitate the bell curve in Murray. And you know who else did that too? That gets a little bit of props set is Joe Rogan. And that's a big reason why I have a problem with Joe Rogan.
He flirts with the fascists all the time, Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan definitely had Sam Harris on. And what happens is people try to make that conversation a conversation of a taboo. Like, I'm going so deep with this science that some will call it racist, but really it's just science. And it's all about IQ, right? That was his whole thing, was IQ. He says, I'm a Californian. I remember that story coming out and am ashamed to say didn't know that it was happening. It's astounding the viciousness of eugenic policies. It is vicious. And like I said, it's a heavy conversation, and I don't think it's one that we can do justice in one episode. So we got to bring Brother Jeff back if he's cool to come back.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I think I'm retiring for this evening.
Okay. A little later where you are.
Man. Right. Thank you very much, brother.
Thank you very much.
All right. Y'all take care.
Have a good one. So we talked about Donald Trump a little bit and one of his pardons. And the reason why I'm wearing this shirt is Harry O, the actual man behind Death Row Records, got a pardon. He was a enormous drug dealer that wanted to get into the entertainment business. He even got Denzel. What was it? The first black producer of a Broadway play is Harry O, and I think he did it from prison. He definitely had a falling out with Death Row over money, as you can imagine, while he was in jail. There was a documentary about him and his involvement with Death Row in like 2001, 2002 called Stranded on Death Row. It's a very, very informative look on Death Row. And we're going to play a little bit of that episode of a clip of that so you know who Harry O is, the newly pardoned Harry O. So the story was, and we'll probably talk a little bit about this more Thursday, and I don't know how true it is. I just heard it real quick when I was listening to Democracy Now!, and I turned around and said, what? That Donald Trump, and this, of course, Donald Trump didn't. This is all from someone that's heard it from someone, right? Was saying that $2 million is what he needed to get you a pardon.
Yeah.
So
it came out of Giuliani's mouth.
It came out of Giuliani's mouth. So it's probably true because Giuliani is the worst dry snitch ever. And apparently he was giving the staffers like $50,000 bonuses for finding people who wanted to get pardoned. So it's when people always say he's pardoning his friends, it sounds like he's just pardoning whoever's going to give him $2 million. Because I don't think Donald Trump knew Harry O. Because Harry O's been in prison for he's been in prison for so long. Joe says $2 million, that's it. Hey, 100 pardons. How much money is that? Do the math. $200 million.
Oh man.
How long do you think it took him to make $200 million once that phone call went out? The phones was hot. Did he pardon Wheezy too? Is Lil Wayne in jail?
I think he's going to jail on some weapons charges, isn't he? Or drug charges.
Then there was a rapper. They said he pardoned some rappers, so that could be the rapper that he pardoned. And Wayne did. DT was listening to deep cuts off Death Row Records. I don't think he was listening to RBX's first record. But so that being said, and once again, before we even play anything, shout out to Jeff Canady for coming on here and literally just, we could have just both logged off and had him do the whole show because he killed it.
He did.
He killed it. He not one word was wasted.
Not one.
That's all knowledge. So props is an understatement for what we have to give that man. That he came in and dropped the bomb. So we appreciate that. So we're going to leave you guys with Harry O and the story, the real story, the true Hollywood story of Death Row Records. And we're going to stay on to talk a little shit while it plays.